So prayer. Prayer is our joy, it's our fulfillment, and it is our purpose. Kind of like the man in the desert, the gaunt, starving man, prayer acts as food, as drink for that man. It suffices to fill him in both taste and hunger and thirst, such as prayer in our life. Ultimate purpose, ultimate fulfillment, ultimate joy. But, I mean, obviously with you all, if you prayed before, you obviously know that prayer is something that is going to be somewhat difficult at times. It's going to be something that is dry and something that's a bit of a struggle from time to time. Now, it can even be a struggle in prayer. I'm not just talking about getting into prayer, right? It can also be a struggle within the prayer itself. So how is it that we're going to compare prayer to something like our very purpose, our joy, our hope in life, and yet at the same time our experiences sometimes seem, at least by appearances, to speak to the complete opposite? So my purpose here in this talk, and you guys just interrupt me anytime you have questions or anything like that too, that's fine. But my purpose in this talk is kind of to tear down that ugly veil that covers over prayer. Prayer is something a lot more than simply a struggle, but it's our ultimate end. It's our reward in life. Heaven itself is perfect prayer. So how are we going to get there? How are we going to tear down that veil over the glorious banquet of prayer, right? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the meaning of prayer. After talking about the meaning of prayer, I'm going to give you some practical tips. But by talking about the meaning of prayer, I hope to answer that question, to uncover the secret of prayer that I just spoke of. And then once you have an appetite for it, I'll give you a few tips from my own repertoire. And we'll see how to go from there. So first of all, meaning. We're going to talk about meaning, and then we're going to break out, and then when we come back, we will talk about practical tips. So meaning. Why is it so important to talk about the meaning of prayer, particularly before you get to the practicalities? I think an analogy for this would be some sport, like take football, for instance. You could play with your friends, and given enough time, people would accidentally come across football. The things that they do and play would accidentally be football. Think of the old story of monkeys. You put a bunch of monkeys at a typewriter, eventually they're going to type Shakespeare. You give them an infinite amount of time, eventually they're going to type Shakespeare. But the probabilities are so low, it would probably take a good period of time. The same thing goes with anything, right? You give enough time, you will probably stumble across the same thing, but not intentionally. Never intentionally. And since prayer requires a type of intention, you need to know what you're doing. It can't just be accidental. There has to be some knowledge and intent behind it. To say otherwise is like an alchemist training a chemist on chemistry. Or you could kind of analogize it to a kid who studies, or a kid who pretends to be a doctor and then teaches somebody else to be an MD. The MD, this instance, the child teaching somebody to be an MD who pretends to be a doctor is probably better than somebody who can't give you a definition for prayer, because at least that kid could probably give you a working definition of what a doctor is. So we ought to understand what prayer is. We ought to understand what it is. Take a moment and consider in the church history, a lot of you all are pretty familiar with this stuff. What is it that the Inquisition always had such a problem with mystics? Besides the fact that you just had some oddballs who just didn't have anything to do with the Spirit. But the ones who kind of did. Think of St. Ignatius of Loyola or Teresa of Avila. Think of some of these people who ran into the Inquisition. What was it that the Inquisition had an issue with, or a potential issue with? Heresy? Heresy, of course. But heresy because the person had no good relationship and prayer life with God, or for some other reason? Potentially another reason. Oftentimes what happens with a mystic, and you can see this in the quietist heresies, for instance. Often what happens with a mystic is they might have a good prayer life and relationship with God, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to see a way to communicate that with others. Without this ability to communicate it to others, they can lead others astray, even though they themselves might have a very good prayer life.
Can you reiterate the name of the heresy?
Quietism. Quietism, that would be with, what was the guy's name? Bay. And the guy's name was Bay, one of the famous heretics on that. But it's a heresy back in I think the 1600s, not entirely sure. But one of the things you saw there is you had the heresiarch, who probably had a pretty good relationship and a pretty good prayer life from what we seem to be able to see there. But his communication to the people and the people who adopted the belief, it was something completely different. Something was lost in translation. And so just because you might have a good prayer life doesn't mean you can communicate it well. And just because we can deal with mystics doesn't necessarily mean they're going to help people very well in their prayer life. The ability to communicate is crucial. And the Inquisition was a check on that in some instances. Maybe sometimes too much of a check. But nevertheless, it's one of the issues there. Is why the meaning of prayer is so important. Think of mathematics too. If you understand, and this gets into the practicality of things, if you understand mathematics, then you don't really need practical advice and tips, or at least you need less of it. Because once you know the rules, you can apply it to situations you've never dealt with. Something similar goes with prayer. If you understand what prayer is, you can start to provide your own wealth through this knowledge of how to practically pray better once you know what it is. Now, of course, you should seek out mystics. You should, especially once you can communicate well, because they have something that we don't. I mean, our knowledge of God is lacking. We'll get into that with understanding of what prayer is and how it's a gift. But once you understand what prayer is, there's nothing more practical than this seemingly abstract search right here. In fact, the search for the meaning is the most practical thing you can do to try to understand prayer. So as far as the practical tips go, I'm going to give it to you from two sources. I'm going to give you a little bit of my own understanding, my own experience. This is where some of the helpful advice of prayer is going to come from, but also just logic. I'll give you a little background because you have to bolster your authority if it's going to be just coming from my authority. I have provided citations for just about everything that I cite in there, and you can follow along your outline. And I'm not going to say it out loud except for a few instances. So you can look at the catechism citations or scripture, and as you know with the catechism, it often gives you the source documents for the catechetical statements. But I'm also going to give you stuff from my own experience, especially for the practical tips. Now, I'm not claiming to be a mystic, and a lot of my prayer is very dry. Truth be told, I've had a few instances of what you might call ecstasy. I'm not quite sure of where I literally, in prayer, could not conceive of something happier. I understood that probably this wasn't heaven, but I could not conceive of how heaven could be better, only abstractly holding the possibility of it. So I have a little bit of experience with prayer in that regard, but at the same time, I would not call myself a mystic, nor would I call myself somebody who very well consistently follows his prayer as well as he should. I fall into sloth all the time, and idols constantly are something I'm battling with and trying to overcome, just the petty things in life. As far as logic goes, as you know, I have some experience in law, I have a degree in philosophy, so hopefully I can give you a little bit of the logic there, but you can judge for yourself too once you can go and do some research on your own. So, what is prayer? First section, meaning of prayer. Again, the most important thing to search out the practicality of prayer. I'm defining prayer as raising one's mind and heart to God. Doing that for the purpose of petition, intercession, thanksgiving, praise, and adoration. I think that bears repeating again. Prayer, as I'm going to have it defined, is raising one's heart and mind to God for the purposes of petition, intercession, thanksgiving, praise, or adoration. So, Just giving you a definition is one thing, but if you don't necessarily trust my authority, where does this come from? This comes from the Catechism, more or less, and I've condensed several things in the Catechism into this definition. The statement of prayer being the raising of one's heart or mind to God comes from a section of the Catechism that is 2559. Also comes from St. John of Damascus. Now, in addition to that, the statement says, or the requesting of good things from God. Now, what I saw with that definition is it is a good definition, but the petition there, the petitionary aspect, the requesting of good things from God, seems to be a purpose of that raising of one's mind and heart to God. It's one of the purposes. And the church does list several other purposes in 2623 to 2649. Those other ones are thanksgiving and praise. And it's unclear whether you include adoration in it. Some lists will include it, some lists won't, because praise and adoration, it's hard to distinguish the two. I am going to distinguish them, though, so I'm going to list those as the purposes. So that's where the definition comes from. As Catholics, we can easily jump the gun on those things. We don't have to search high and low for it. The church provides a pretty clear definition, and we can kind of condense the purposes of the prayer into that definition. Now, to understand what that means, though, is something else. Analysis of a definition can give you a whole wealth of information. A simple statement like that we could study for ages. And what I'm going to do with this is break down that definition. The first part is the prayer itself, and the second part, the purposes. Petition, intercession, thanksgiving, praise, and adoration. But the first part of the prayer, what unifies all prayer, is the raising of one's heart and mind to God. So we're going to look at the raising part, we're going to look at the heart and mind part, and we're going to look at the meaning of to God. Look at the meaning of all those things. Now the first one, the raising, this is the activity of prayer. It's not being raised, but raising. Now, unless there be confusion, both Scripture and the Church clearly teach that prayer is a gift. It's not a pure activity of ours. Now there's cooperation. And this is the other extreme one could go to. One could go to a passivity. And the Church also teaches that it's not purely passive. It's active. You might say an active participation is what happens in prayer. This does not remove it from being a gift. And one might think, well, if you're actively doing something in order to achieve prayer, doesn't that mean that it's no longer a gift? Not so. It's a common misunderstanding. This is something I take from law school here in studies of contracts. I thought this was a clever analogy. So in contracts, you have this question. The United States will enforce contracts generally when you have something called consideration. It's basically something given for the thing traded in the contract. And one might say to themselves, well, how is it then that any promise is a gift? Because in any promise, it seems there's things one has to do in order to receive the gift. Isn't that given in exchange for the gift? And thus no longer making it a gift, but a trade, a contract, a consideration for the thing being given. Well, take this analogy. Take a homeless person on the street. You don't have a jacket. You realize it's cold outside, and you pass this poor homeless shivering guy. You tell the guy, get up, walk with me. We're going to the store. We're going to pick you out a jacket, and you can put it on. Is it no longer a gift because in order to receive the benefit, the homeless person actually has to put on the jacket? Is it no longer a gift because he has to walk with the person to receive the jacket? Of course not. Because that walking and the putting on is not something being traded for value for the jacket. It's simply something that has to be done in order to receive the gift. Much of grace in our life is like that. And there's some confusion, I think, in the Protestant faith on that very point. We have to work, and in fact, it's a struggle sometimes in order to receive the gift. But this work doesn't make it any less a gift. You kind of look at the servants, right? When Jesus says, well, you do your work and you come to the master, does he give you thanks for doing just simply what you have to do? No, because it's not something above and beyond the gift itself. It's not something given for the trade in that gift. It remains a gift, despite there being conditions necessary in order to receive it. Yeah.
Is the offer for that gift of prayer, is that open to everybody, to baptized persons?
Prayer is offered to anybody, but there's a precondition for prayer, namely repentance, conversion. That's a prerequisite for prayer. And hence, there's also a mediator for it. And we'll get into that. We'll get into why it can only really, truly be done through Christ. So we'll get into that in a second. So, again, it's still a gift. It's a gift, but it requires active participation. You have to bring something to the prayer. Prayer isn't something done to you exclusively. Rather, it's something you have to cooperate in. Now, there's only one mediator between God and man, and this is Christ. We know this through the faith, but we can also see this through logic. God is the infinite, right? God is absolutely infinite, and we are finite. What does that mean logically? Can finite ever reach the infinite? Can something that is finite ever achieve infinity? No matter how much finite things you add together, you're never going to produce the infinite. Just a reminder also to the first part of why prayer has to be a gift, because nothing you could possibly do would ever merit the infinite. It's just not a value of the infinite logically. This also means that we need a mediator in prayer. If it is the raising up to God and God is the infinite, then there is nothing we can do by being finite to reach that end. We need a mediator. We need somebody to lift us up out of the cave, you might say, into the light of God. Now, how is this? For us, we say it's Christ, and this is true. This is the Logos. This is God himself. The infinite himself has to lift us up. So considering this fact of the raising, again, we're focusing on raising here, considering this raising has to be done by God, we need to look to God and what he requires of us in order to reach the infinite. So following his commands, following the sacraments, making your life more like his example. These are necessary requirements in this raising up. So if one actively seeks to avoid that mediation in Christ, one is going to fall short in prayer. Simply because only the infinite, only God himself can raise us up to prayer. The requirements he sets down are the things that we just necessarily have to go through. So also this raising has to be done at all times. Prayer is to be done at absolutely all times. It includes in the hereafter. Prayer is to be done at all times. But we are limited creatures with limited time. How do we build a habit in order to achieve something that we do constantly? How do we build up habits? What are some things we do to build habits? Practice. Intense, deliberate practice. It's not, habits typically don't just come upon us. We have to intensely do specific things in order to build a habit. Now, what are the intense types of prayers that we do in order to build the disposition of our minds and hearts to constantly be raised up to God? Well, the church teaches there are three types of intense prayer: deliberate and active prayer. One is by word, one is by meditation, and one is by contemplation. Contemplation being the highest of them. You can kind of think of this in a relationship, right? You want to build a relationship with somebody, you want to enter into communion with somebody else, you're going to have to be thinking about that person, meditation, and you're going to have to be talking with that person in order to enter into that prayer. Communicate with them, you might say. It doesn't have to necessarily be by words. We'd say words, but a communication with the person, a talking to that person, and a thinking about that person. So meditation being the thinking, verbal being a more communicative, you talking to God and potentially receiving, kind of talking back in some special instances. Meditation is something not thought of often, but if we are raising our minds to God, this can mean something like philosophy can actually be prayer when the end of philosophy is God. Theology as well. Might come as a surprise Right? Pick up Denzinger's designation sometime or the catechism and study it for prayer. And that is and can be prayer if done for the right intention. Ulterior motives, obviously, if it's not to God, obviously it wouldn't be prayer. But meditation, that is the intellectual reflecting upon God. There's other ways to do it too with the heart more, engage the heart more in this process, like Lectio Divina and so forth, of placing yourself in the scriptures and thinking about it. But the highest form of prayer is contemplative. That's being in the presence of God, simply being in his presence. Now, since God is infinite and everything that we can think of and say is finite, what does that say about contemplation? And what state must contemplation be done in? It's going to be a little bit more passive in at least one way. Your mind and your heart need to be more receptive than they need to be active. At the same time, of course, you have to be striving for it. If you've ever tried to enter into contemplative prayer and think you can just go to sleep with it, it's not going to happen. You have to be very active in that state. But the other sense is silence. It's crucial. Silence is crucial for contemplative prayer. So, raising of one's mind, it's a gift. It's through a mediator, and we can achieve this constant state, or begin to achieve this constant state, when we do it by word, contemplation, or meditation and contemplation. And again, don't rule out many things with prayer. Don't be too exclusive with the idea of prayer only when it needs to be done so. Again, things like studying can become prayerful. You have orders like the Dominicans, for instance, where their study becomes a type of prayer. It's not the highest prayer. The contemplative prayer is not going to be necessarily philosophical. It's not going to be against philosophy. But something like intellectual reflection indeed can be prayer and can be a prerequisite for some people for entering into the contemplative prayer, depending on the graces and gifts God bestows on us. So now let's look at the mind and heart. So we looked at the raising. Now let's look at mind and heart. Now, does it say raise some of your mind and heart up? Part of your mind and heart up? No. Raise your mind and heart up. All of it. Do you have a question, Glenn?
No, it's
okay.
all.
All of it. All of it.
Bolded and italicized.
Absolutely. That outline is bold and italicized. So if you're to raise all your heart and your mind to God, that's going to exclude certain things from prayer. It's going to exclude double-mindedness, as James tells us. You cannot be double-minded and do prayer. What does double-mindedness mean? Double-mindedness is either doubt or an impure motive in your prayer. What do those two things look like? Heart and mind, right? Doubt involves the mind, and the heart involves the impurity of motives. Think the pure of heart will see God. The pure of heart will have their selves raised up to God. So double-mindedness is forbidden. Now, I think to yourself, doubt. What is doubt? Because having doubt is being double-minded in prayer. It's important to distinguish between temptation to doubt and doubt itself. Yeah, Christian.
Yeah, how would that relate to somebody who prays like, God, if you're there, help me in my algebra test?
Right. Again, temptation to doubt and doubt itself. What would you think temptation to doubt is versus doubt itself? What is doubt? Just give us a definition of doubt.
Questioning whether God exists or exists as he truly does.
Is it so much the questioning or the withholding of assent? The intellectual withholding of assent. Because the questioning might be the temptation aspect of it. Whereas the actual withholding, actual doubt, is a withholding of one's mind from God in some way. So if we actually doubt, we're withholding some of our mind, if not all of our mind, from God. Yet if raising the heart and mind to God is part of the definition of prayer, then it, by definition, is not prayer when you have doubt. True doubt, actual doubt. I'm not talking about the temptation to doubt. I'm not talking about the struggles that we all have, or many people have with prayer and understanding God. But actual doubt, actual withholding of intellectual assent for God. If you do that, it's simply not prayer. you can't achieve prayer either in your petitions or whatever else you ask for. It's just not prayer. So double-mindedness cannot happen. Now, if we're raising our hearts and minds to God, an important thing here is to look at the prerequisite that follows logically from prayer. Now, of course, the church teaches that conversion is a prerequisite for prayer. The purgative way, the entrance into prayer, you might call it. The church teaches this. Well, we can just see it logically from that definition of prayer. If we're to raise our hearts and minds to God, our hearts and minds must be to God, not to something else, not to an idol, not to something that gets in the way of it. Now, if you look at the word that's translated conversion from the New Testament, it's metanoia. Metanoia, it's Greek, basically means with or after the mind. With or after the mind, more or less. You can also translate it as a change of mind. Conversion meaning a change of mind. Now, of course, the heart and the mind are very much related, so it's not a far step to say a change of heart as well. But think of metamorphosis. Metamorphosis, right? You have a connection to form and meta. It's a similar Greek root there. So if conversion is a change of mind or being done with the mind, then obviously one needs to have conversion to enter into prayer. So, conversion being a prerequisite also excludes two people from entering very deep in prayer. They get stuck on the purgative way or don't do the purgative way at all, which is a prerequisite for prayer. Lax people who don't consider conversion and try and enter into deeper prayer without conversion and thus never begin it in the first place, or scrupulous people who get stuck on the purgative way and thus never enter into prayer. You can either get stuck in conversion, which is better than not at all, or you can avoid the conversion, try and avoid the conversion altogether. Either way, those two ways are going to be stumbling blocks to prayer, both laxism and scrupulosity. And those are different topics to be addressed at a different time, I think. But
so you're not saying that one physically or cannot pray if they're living in one state of sin, just that they have to be moving away from it? Or?
No, I would actually say if you are in a state of mortal sin, you have to be brought out of that state of mortal sin to actually engage in prayer. You have to be brought out. Now, the being brought out kind of happens before the completion of conversion because God moves the person to the conversion. But being truly within the state of mortal sin, you truly are separated from God. Your heart and your mind cannot be in His presence in that state. So yes, true prayer, the intent to enter into prayer can happen before that. But true prayer cannot occur within the mortal sin itself. Now this brings us to something, right? If it's the raising of all one's mind and heart to God, we don't fully know God this side of the grave, and we struggle with our idols this side of the grave, and we have all these temptations and distractions, and we don't know our final end this side of the grave. What does that say about prayer this side of the grave? Probably not going to be perfectly achieved this side of the grave. What does it also look like prayer is? The completion of prayer, what does that look like? If it's raising one's heart and mind to God, what does that sound like to you, Catholic doctrine-wise? Beatific vision. The being in absolute presence of God is prayer. Now, this side of the grave, perfect prayer is pretty much impossible. Prayer this side of the grave is a battle. It involves a battle. It doesn't mean every moment of it's dry. That is not the case at all. God gives us occasionally, depending on the graces He chooses to bestow on us, a foretaste of heaven from time to time. But prayer this side of the grave is a struggle and it is a battle. We move into perfect prayer, but we never achieve it this side of the grave. The closest we get are the mystical encounters that approach but do not achieve the beatific vision. Church teaches, Scripture teaches that beatific vision this side of the grave just doesn't happen. We get close to it, but we don't achieve it. That is something for the next life. That is the reward. Perfect prayer then is the reward. And I think you're starting to see now how what I said at the beginning about prayer being our purpose, our end, our joy is true from this looking into the definition of what prayer is. So, looked at it in the heart, in the mind. and a little more focus on the heart now. We look at Messianism. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right at all. Messianism is a heresy, and it's a danger for the charismatics. And I'm not hitting on the charismatic movement in the slightest. I don't know much well about it, but I do see great fruits that can potentially be had in it. But this would be a temptation for them, just like the opposite would be a temptation for maybe a more dry version of looking at the faith, I suppose. But this type of heresy would suggest that in order to judge whether you are doing prayer right, you feel it. That's a requirement for prayer. Now, understanding we don't have a beatific vision this side of the grave, and understanding how the church teaches prayer is a battle, this is just not true at all. Now, it can be a factor in judging it. You want to bring the whole self into service of God. And ultimately, in heaven, those two things are going to be together. On this side of the grave, not everything works together, and sometimes that's something that God puts out to prove the higher parts of us, namely our heart and our will, over the effects of our bodies. To prove their strength, sometimes they have to suffer in the darkness of dryness or even the desolations of the dark night. Do not think that just because you aren't feeling something that it's necessarily something's wrong. However, don't discount that altogether. Not having the feelings is something to look at. It is something to look at. It's just not something to get stuck on. You're going to have those dry periods. God's going to grant that sort of grace it is, to people to learn to pray better.